Hey, Amy.
Hi, Jeff. How have you been?
Good to be with you again.
Yeah, it's good to
We
talk.
should introduce ourselves.
I'm Amy Sullivan, and I'm a contributing writer for Time Magazine.
I'm Jeff Sharlet, and I'm an assistant professor of English at Dartmouth College and a contributing editor for Harper's Magazine and Rolling Stone. And we are together again today by walking heads to talk about religion in the news. And so I think we agreed that it's in some ways a quiet summer, but of course the presidential race is heating up, and we've just had our first kind of real Republican debate. There was one before, but this is the first real debate where they're really going to dig into substantive, serious issues with the heavyweight contenders. And one of the things that sort of struck me about it was that they, in fact, introduced a sort of whole new theme for the debate, which is the Republican baby race. I don't know if you noticed it, that when they were each given a single sentence to introduce themselves, and Rick Santorum, former Senator Rick Santorum, author of a book called It Takes a Family, as it was rebuttal to Hillary Clinton's It Takes a Village, introduced himself. What is his primary credential? Why is he running for president? He has 7 children. Okay. Michele Bachmann followed up, and she really stole the show. If you count her foster children, she has 28. So
Right.
Go back to
Beat
Pennsylvania,
that.
Rick.
Yeah.
Well, Gingrich tried to, but he overreached as usual. He just sort of talked about the 14 million Americans out of work who are like his children.
Right. Well, and he can't really talk about his kids and his grandkids because he always says Callista and my grandkids, and everybody knows they're not Callista's grandkids, so that just gets people
Well,
upset.
I have to say, having a stepmother-in-law, that I am all for stepmother rights.
Right, although she's several stepmothers removed.
That's true. So Gingrich was really at a disadvantage. You know who really won the day was Ron Paul, who trumped them all. He says, "Well, I have delivered 4,000 babies." I mean, each person gave an answer that was really typical of themselves. Romney kind of padded his numbers by adding in 5 daughters-in-law. And Pawlenty has only 2 kids, but he's quick to add. He says, "But I'm also a neighbor," which I thought was really interesting because who exactly is not a neighbor, and what does that mean that he's a neighbor? He didn't say he's a good neighbor. He's a neighbor.
A neighbor,
So,
yes.
yeah, so he was trying to change. He was trying to shift the discussion from babies to, I guess, borrowing cups of sugar and other important things. It was a powerhouse debate. What did you hear in the debate, Amy?
Well, other than the baby counting, which I have to just add, I think Mitt Romney needs to recognize that this doesn't always work in his favor. When his wife introduced him at the Faith and Freedom Conference a couple weeks ago, she also was going through the list of children and grandchildren. And she's incredibly good-looking and youthful for her age. So it's a little odd to see this young-looking woman standing up and talking about her 16 grandchildren. And I think the fact that they're Mormon needs to factor into the kind of optics of what that looks like. He also, last time around in Ames, Iowa, brought all of his family up on stage because they'd all spent the summer working for him in Iowa. And again, it was kind of the image of the Mormon candidate with just dozens of cloned-looking children standing up on the stage, and they were adorable, but if he doesn't want to feed into people's fears of large polygamous Mormon families, he might want to avoid that in the future.
So he wants to follow Tim Pawlenty into the neighbor track and talk about his neighbors. Although I think that would be probably embarrassing for him because as a very, very wealthy man, I mean, who knows who his neighbors are? It's probably...
Well, he lives in Belmont. It's a nice neighborhood, but it's not crazy.
Oh, he doesn't have a fabulous house? Well, then I think he should go with the neighbors.
He might want to... Yeah, well, as long as he doesn't do a John McCain, it depends on which house I'm talking about and which neighbors I have. But back to the substance.
I have neighbors and I do not have neighbors. I have known neighbors and unknown neighbors.
Yes.
But there were real issues in this debate.
I had, I guess, 2 main thoughts coming out of the debate. One was just kind of a bit of sorrow and shame for our profession. everybody's kind of knocked CNN for doing the deep dish or thin crust pizza, and the Coke or Pepsi, which, forcing people to choose between the two, I think was really unfair, since Dr. Pepper obviously should have factored in there as an option. But it was just most frustrating to see the distance between the questions that actual people were sending in via email and Twitter, and that were put up on the screen by John King, and he would read them, but then not throw them to the candidates. Things about Libya, things about would you have made the same call in terms of the mission to go get Osama bin Laden. Some of these things were actually pretty cool, and yet candidates didn't get a chance to ask them, because then there wouldn't have been time for these stupid this or that questions. I wish I could say I think that's going to change during the course of the campaign, but of course that's not what we've seen in the past. But I think that's maybe even more important this time around, with the economy just figuring so large in people's minds, and as a factor really on their minds as they look at the campaign. So I just wanted to flag that, because it's not usually so stark this early on in the campaign. And the second thing was that although I've heard a number of candidates already kind of go after Muslims in particular and highlight sharia as a big concern, and I know we're going to get into that later, it did kind of surprise me that it came up in this first debate, because it just, I think, set a tone for the debate in terms of fear-mongering and scapegoating that I would have thought you'd want to wait until things are kind of playing out, and it might be the play of a more desperate candidate. But no, that's what Herman Cain and Newt Gingrich just wanted to lead with here, is we are afraid of Muslims. We want to make them take loyalty oaths. And by the way, we want to outlaw their religious code and not allow them to practice their religion in the U.S. So those were kind of the two takeaways that struck me the most. What about you?
Yeah, well, me too. I mean, and you really have to do some work to make Rick Santorum look like a religious moderate, as he did. It was left to Santorum to talk about the sort of First Amendment rights and the idea that everyone can bring their own religious views or lack of religious views into the public square, and you've got
it was that faith and no faith that was interesting, because that's the phrase Obama usually uses, and I've never heard Santorum use it.
Well, Santorum's had a lot of, one thing we should say probably is that he's had a lot of practice at being a lightning rod. He knows that no one is ever going to doubt his frankly, his fanaticism, whether you like it or not. So he has some leeway to do that. But Herman Cain, who has gone from sort of a novelty candidate to being this guy who is actually sort of moving the conversation in a serious way. And most notably, for those who didn't watch it, John King, in a good question, sort of said, let's talk about the fact that you said that you would not appoint a Muslim to your cabinet. And Cain kind of sort of dithered, and he said, well, I might appoint a Muslim if it was the good kind. There's a good kind and an evil kind. The good kind doesn't want to kill us. The evil kind, of course, wants to kill us, which brings to mind actually a terrific book on this, Mahmoud Mamdani's Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, this great study of the way not just Herman Cain, but a lot of the American media, mainstream press, sort of makes this kind of this divide, well, there are good Muslims and bad Muslims. And Herman Cain really, in some ways, wasn't so fringe. He was playing right into that. Newt Gingrich, of course, jumped right on it, and if anything, sounded a little more extreme on this. What he said. He said, in terms of outlawing Muslims, is basically what it sounded like he's talking about. He said, we did this in dealing with the Nazis, and we did this in dealing with the communists, and it was controversial both times, and both times we discovered after a while, there are some genuinely bad people who would like to infiltrate our country, and we have to have the guts to stand up and say no, which is astonishing rhetoric. I think this is, what do you think? Does this qualify as hate speech?
I think it does, and I think it has. It's what he's been pushing since he was out in the forefront about the so-called Ground Zero Mosque issue last year. And what's striking is Gingrich is not a dumb guy. I don't think he's the ideas man that everybody holds him up as, because it's important to note there are good ideas and there are really bad ideas. So saying you're an ideas man is maybe no better than saying you're a neighbor. But he has not had any compunction about just going all over the place and saying things that just flatly contradict each other, as long as they get people whipped up about Muslims. And that seems to me to just be the most irresponsible politicking, because he is simply trying to say whatever it takes to get people scared of Muslims. And the debate was yet another example of that. On the subject of loyalty oaths, he actually said, there's nothing stopping somebody who, wants to cause terrorism from lying and, giving a loyalty oath anyway and not meaning it. And yet, we need to impose loyalty oaths and make sure that everybody says them.
Yeah, and he went even a little further and said, basically, it doesn't matter whether a Muslim takes a loyalty oath because you can't trust Muslims.
Right.
They lie. And so then you get this thing where Romney that was his chance to play moderate and say, call them out and say, you're calling for purity tests and litmus tests about religion. I wondered, Herman Cain, I think, just sort of a little bit shoots from the hips. Newt Gingrich, you're right, he's not the ideas man, good or bad, that he claims to be, but he is a pretty cunning politician. Mm-hmm. And I've wondered, looking at some of this anti-Muslim rhetoric, obviously this plays well with one crowd, but I wonder if they're also just this is a backdoor to talking about religious difference, which hurts one candidate more than any other, Mitt Romney. They can't take shots at Mormons, but they can take shots at vaguely un-American religions. Can we trust them? They're different than us. They are infiltrating, now they're on Broadway, they're in South Park and all this kind of thing. It reminds me a little bit of, you go back to the Nixon years. And, there was that one famous discussion. Nixon wanted to stoke fears. He wanted to sort of signal to folks who didn't like hippies and who didn't like civil rights, didn't like African Americans, but he couldn't come out, he wasn't George Wallace, he couldn't come out and say this. So the apocryphal story is that there was actually a discussion in which they talked about how can we sort of signal our opposition to these groups. And they decided on marijuana and heroin. They're going to talk about fighting drugs. When you talk about fighting about marijuana, it would hit that subconscious note. You're talking about hippies. When you talk about heroin, it would signal for these white suburban voters inner city problems, and that would make them think of African Americans. So in some ways, the hate speech against Muslims does double duty because it obviously refers to Muslims and appeals to those who are angry at that group. But it's also flagging religious difference, and it's also putting Mitt Romney in this position where he has to constantly say we shouldn't have religious litmus tests, which reminds everybody that he's a Mormon. And once upon a time, he would not have passed a mainstream religious litmus test.
Right.
50 years ago, a Mormon candidate would not have made it nearly as far as he did.
It does, although I don't think he is forced to be in that position. I actually give him points for going further than he needed to during the debate. There's no question that it also serves to help protect the religious minority he's part of, at least a minority in the U.S. I don't think that that's actually the main reason that they're going after it. And again, it's one of the reasons why I think Gingrich is so dangerous on this, because I think he's just trying to create a culture of fear, and that kind of the overall thought behind that is the more afraid American voters are, the more damaging questions about Obama and whether he's one of us will be, and that maybe the thought is that that's one of the Republicans' best hopes next November, is to raise sufficient questions, which, was done a bit in 2008, but nothing like what we've seen once Obama's been in office. And, now that they don't have the birth certificate to talk about anymore, I think this has become a not so subtle way of getting people whipped up about anybody who has any connection to Islam, and therefore, possibly Obama is infiltrating Muslim in the White House.
Right. Well, let's not forget, though, they still do have the birth certificate issue. That's the amazing thing. I mean, I'm here in fairly liberal Hanover, New Hampshire, and right there in the Dartmouth College bookstore, a big stack of Jerome Corsi's Where's the Birth Certificate? Which was probably, he must be bitter. Jerome Corsi, remember, is the swift boat, I was about to say swift boat veteran of swift boating political candidates. And now he's sort of obviously got a contract to do this birth certificate book, events past him, but that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of conservatives out there who are as certain that Obama doesn't have a real birth certificate as we are all certain that the moon landing was, of course, faked. But that thing of stoking fear and giving points to Mitt Romney, which is interesting. Giving point, he did go further than he had to, and sort of saying, look, this is just not how we're going to do things. And the other person that we were talking before earlier today, and that we both sort of gave points to, or points is the right word, but were surprised by her sanity, was Michele Bachmann. Mm-hmm. Michele Bachmann, who emerged on a couple of issues as the less extreme candidate than several others.
Yeah, she definitely, I think, went in with low expectations in terms of people either not knowing much about her at all, or what they did know being that she could be kind of a bug-eyed crazy woman. And, to her credit, came off as a pretty impressive political figure. I mean, she's very good as a speaker. She can say things with absolute certainty and conviction. And the problem is sometimes the things she says with absolute certainty and conviction are just off the wall. But sometimes they're not. And so she just kind of has this way of pulling in the audience with her. And she just kind of ruled that stage on the debate night. Yeah,
and I mean, one, she got to dodge talking about Muslims, and if she had, she would have been, I think, off the charts on that. She's got a long record of hate speech on that score. But when it came to a question about same-sex marriage, and whether or not the candidates would pursue a constitutional amendment to define marriage as one man, one woman, I think she was the first to answer, and her response was, "I believe in states' rights. States' rights trump that." And the debate is in New Hampshire, where that's same-sex marriage is an issue. She says, "I'm not going to go into New Hampshire if I'm president and try and tell them what to do." Now that's hardly a liberal position or even a moderate one. She's obviously very, very anti-gay, but she's not talking about making fighting gay marriage another front in the war on terror, which Tim Pawlenty quickly leapt to grab the sword and was ready to declare a war on same-sex marriage. And then it went down the list of candidates, and most of them, but with the exception of Ron Paul, of course, said that they would pursue this constitutional amendment. Mm-hmm. So you're sitting there thinking, wow, Michele Bachmann is the most moderate one here. But then she disappointed us because after she had heard everyone else go for constitutional amendment, she said, okay, well, I would do a constitutional amendment forbidding it too, but I wouldn't trample on states' rights. So that was actually maybe the truer Michele Bachmann shining through a kind of nonsensical answer. But a nonsensical answer that will probably kind of play well in the primaries. And as you said, she came out of this as a sort of political figure. Everyone's talking about Romney, the big winner. My read is that Michele Bachmann was the winner. Romney lost no ground. No one was really wanted to take a piece out of him. But Michele Bachmann is now, I think, very quickly displacing Tim Pawlenty as the Minnesotan to watch out for.
Right. Well, Pawlenty is quickly losing the case that he has for his place in the Republican field. It's kind of premised on Romney not actually being real as a candidate who has any chance. And certainly that wasn't the feel that people had coming out of the debate. So there's that one position of kind of the more establishment down the road candidate who can win a general election. And then obviously there's a role for the candidate who can win Republican primary voters who tend to be more conservative and focused on social issues. And the race for that was kind of wide open after Mike Huckabee said that he wasn't getting in. And Michele Bachmann seems to have kind of very quickly nailed that down as kind of the candidate to beat with those voters, which is interesting because a lot of people had said, well, maybe Sarah Palin will get in if those voters are up in the air for grabs. I've been hearing a lot of talk about Republican or religious right leaders trying to get Rick Perry to get into the race, that he would be their preferred candidate for that social conservative vote. But Bachmann seems to have done a pretty good job of establishing that she could be that candidate, and then it's a matter of who faces off to make the argument that someone like that doesn't have a chance in hell of winning against Barack Obama. I guess I found it fascinating, that discussion about separation of church and state and about religious litmus tests, because that's an argument that's been going on in some ways within the Republican Party about how far out there do we want to be on these issues. But you very rarely see it in front of cameras like that. That kind of Romney versus some of the more extreme views, that debate usually takes place between a Republican and a Democratic candidate. And so to have that going on in the primaries in a way that we can watch, I find really fascinating, because that's going to be the essential struggle for the nomination.
You might be right, and there were some surprises there too. First of all, Santorum again, sort of taking a more mainstream church-state view, which is that everyone can come into the public square and debate. Tim Pawlenty quoting sort of David Barton, the far-right Christian revisionist historian who says that George Washington was made bulletproof by God and all these kinds of crazy things, saying that the First Amendment exists only to protect people of faith from the government, and that the government is wide open if people of faith want to take it over. Ron Paul comes in, though, and I thought this was really interesting because Ron Paul, obviously gets a lot of libertarian support, and he's always been this interesting candidate because of his anti-war position, so you get a lot of sort of kind of left libertarians who romanticize Ron Paul and think he's really their guy, and he's funny and everything else. But they forget that Ron Paul has this kind of very, very stringent Christian right history. I mean, the only candidate, major candidate who has had and or ever will have, I think, ties to Christian Reconstructionism, that very far right wing. And Ron Paul goes out there and says, the Constitution addresses church and state by saying, quote, he says, literally it says no theocracy, which was interesting because actually it doesn't say that. It really doesn't say anything about theocracy. But then he goes on to say that all the First Amendment means is that Congress should never prohibit the expression of your Christian faith in a public place, which is certainly a very limited idea of the Christian Amendment, and seems to suggest that the Christian Amendment exists to ensure that schools can put up creches and Christmas trees, and that the expression of your Christian faith in a public place. So I wonder if Ron Paul would come to the defense of Muslim symbols of faith in public places. But it was really quite there was the baby race and there was the race to trample on the First Amendment. Which I think is a dangerous tactic for these candidates, because I think the underappreciated thing about the Tea Party is a lot of people. There are a lot of people in the Tea Party. They do read the Constitution, and there are a great number of free speech absolutists among them. And so this idea of First Amendment is protecting only one category of speech, the Christian speech. That's not going to play even with their far right. That's going to play maybe with a certain kind of sort of suburban evangelical voter, conservative evangelical voter. But I think they're making a mistake.
Well, it's one reason why you see in some states, and this was just in the court in Tennessee a few weeks ago, an effort to define Islam as not a religion. Because if it's not a religion, then it's not covered and protected by the First Amendment. So you can outlaw Muslim practices and beliefs and free speech and all of that. Again, that was kind of shot down pretty easily in Tennessee, and we had just the extraordinary sight of seeing Islam ruled, in fact, a religion. But I don't think that's the last we're going to hear of it. And we were going to move kind of briefly just to talk about the effort to do at the state level what some of these candidates like Herman Cain and Newt Gingrich were talking about, which is to really focus in on Muslims, and the lens for that is a number of bills in now I think 23 states have either considered or passed bills that would outlaw sharia in the courts and the legal system. And that's a pretty astonishing number. You could say, all right, well, I can understand in South Carolina or Georgia or Tennessee, but these are 23 states across the country. And it speaks at the very least to the success of some efforts, I think, by national politicians and some national groups to scapegoat Muslims and make Sharia kind of a proxy word for just fear of the other in general. Because what's interesting, Justin Elliott at Salon has been doing a really good job of following this, and he had a piece a couple of weeks ago going through all of the different sponsors of this legislation who have been asked either to define Sharia or to name, one instance or even type of example of why you would need their bill. What's the type of thing they're concerned about in the legal system in terms of Sharia being used. And they can't. They can't tell you what Sharia is, and they can't tell you why it might ever be necessary in their state to ban the use of Sharia in something like civil arbitration. And that, I think, is the surest sign that these are efforts at fear-mongering and not actually trying to get at something substantive in terms of policy.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, if they were really serious about Sharia, first of all, they'd have to learn what it is, and they've got this absurd kind of reductionist definition that doesn't take into account that Sharia is, by definition, a somewhat relative system of law. I mean, it's I don't know if evolving is the right word, but it's a system that is implemented very differently around the world, is subject to debate of very learned people. That doesn't make it maybe an appropriate system of law for democracy, but it's not the boogeyman they make it out to be in most cases. But that said, you're right. It's they're fear-mongering, and they're not really talking about Sharia. If they were really concerned about alternative systems of law, then they would obviously be leading the fight to crack down on that threat to America, rabbinical courts.
Right.
And rabbinical courts are also an alternative system of law, and they do govern the lives of a lot of Orthodox Jews. In New York City, if you want to sort of go through the press, you can find all kinds of very serious conflicts between public governance and private governance. And while we're at it, if we're really concerned about Sharia law, then we are going to push all the many parachurch ministries to have these internal accountability systems. Well, that's no longer going to do. They're going to have to conform themselves. I mean, it's a silly thing, but as you said, it's not. When we talk about fear mongering, I think it's always important to remind ourselves that there's a phrase that people say, that's just fear mongering, and and I use it too. I think we all use it, and I think that we forget what it's like to be on the other side of fear-mongering. We as people who are maybe not threatened by that find it ugly. If you're on the other side, if you're Muslim in Tennessee where this effort didn't pass, doesn't matter. The message has been loud and clear. The powers that be don't want you there and are willing to pass laws that are targeted at you. That's terrifying. I mean, that's really terrifying. That's what a lot of Muslim immigrants have come to the United States to get away from. That's what we're looking at in the Arab Spring, and it's these people who are trying to outlaw Sharia, this meaningless effort to target Muslims. I mean, and there's a sense in which they're lining themselves up with the Saudis who are funding efforts to fight back against the Arab Spring. They are really lining up against democracy, when your interests are the same as those of democracy, which is the case for so many American Muslims, that puts you in a very frightening spot. So it's not just fear-mongering. It's that's why I wanted to raise a question. Should this be hate speech, and should we really be responding to it as hate speech? Should we respond to Newt Gingrich and Herman Cain, not as if their politicians have gone too far, but as if they're, the American KKK marching to Skokie, Illinois. Remember that famous march? And the ACL defended their right to do it, and I would too. But let's not fool ourselves for a minute about what their message was.
Well, what would it mean to respond to them that way? Because I agree with you that it's worth talking about, but I don't know what it would look like in terms of how that would change our response.
I think that, it calls for, in some ways, symbolic responses. I think of, where was it, Montana years ago, there were some attacks on Jews in a small community. And this little small community, very small conservative community, they did this kind of corny, cheesy thing that a photographer's name slips my mind, documented, and it ends up being very powerful. The local paper, conservative paper, put a Star of David in the newspaper, and you could cut it out, and you could put it in your window. You say, you want to break windows, break my window. Start with mine. That's the kind of, these candidates who are running for president, they talk about leadership. You're reminded of those people who sort of stood up. And so we gave points to Mitt Romney for going a little further than he needed, but in reality, I don't think he went far enough. I think, if someone had stood up there if Newt Gingrich had said, look, Jews have this whole different rabbinical system, and so there will be no Jews in my administration, no one on that platform would have hesitated. They would have been thrilled by the opportunity to denounce him. And all this my friend here goes, my colleague on the right is be a better president than Obama, goes too far and saying no Muslims and they're not welcome in America. They can be in my administration, maybe if I know them really well. This is simple stuff. I mean, even John King. I mean, let's talk about the real response. John King didn't do much. You hear hate speech. You challenge it.
Yeah.
You don't say, that's wrong. You say, tell us more. Tell us more. What do you mean? That should have dominated the debate. And until it doesn't, I think we're all a little bit complicit in sort of saying, there's a liberal side where we say, oh, that's wrong. And there's a conservative side. So there's a point to it. This is ridiculous. Citizens are citizens. That's the very idea of citizenship. And these guys are I don't think it's too strong to say, they're spitting on it.
Right. Well, you raised a couple of interesting points here. I love that Montana story. I hadn't heard that before. I wonder what something like that would look like, because that could be really powerful, kind of, we all are Muslims. Would probably not go over in a lot of parts of the country, but it would be a powerful statement to Muslim Americans. I'm remembering, I think it was the week that Osama bin Laden was killed. There was an incident in Ohio where there was a hotel that had a broken flagpole. And so the flag was kind of stuck at half-mast, and a rumor ran around the town that the hotel had a flag at half-mast, in honor of Osama bin Laden's death. And all of a sudden, the hotel was being boycotted and had all these phone calls coming in, threatening them, and just the most ridiculous stuff. But, that's kind of the feeling that's out there in a lot of places. And it would be nice to think that there are people in the communities who can demonstrate in a very visible way that that's not necessarily the majority opinion. And in fact, in Tennessee, where some of these battles have gone on about allowing Muslim communities to build mosques, there's been an incredible supportive response from people in the community, showing that it is actually a minority of folks who are trying to prevent the building of mosques. But as you say, that doesn't make it any less terrifying. The idea that people in power have the ability and the desire to prevent people from worshiping freely. But the other issue is whether...
let me interrupt there, because not just worshiping freely, just existing freely.
Existing, yes, you're right.
And maybe the problem is that there's the symbolism, a Star of David can stand for Jews of all sorts. Mosque is, of course, for an observant Muslim. And so there's plenty of Muslim Americans who, Muslim Americans in my family, they're not observant, but that's the same message to them. We lack, or we haven't found here in the United States, a symbolism that allows us to address that. But it's got to go beyond just respecting Islam as a religion, but we have to but sort of push back hard against this idea that Muslims aren't real Americans.
Yeah, and that all Muslims are considered guilty unless proven otherwise. But the other issue you raised is, what would happen if somebody pushed back and said, you shouldn't be going after Muslims like that in a debate. Which would have been extraordinary to hear and welcome to hear, I think. But it has almost become that issue that people feel they can't touch in either party, in fact. I don't know if you remember during 2008, I think it was at least 2 of Obama's Muslim outreach coordinators were forced to quit the campaign because of questions about whether they'd worked for an organization that had ties to something that was sketchy, or whether they'd ever said anything that questioned their loyalty to the country, blah, blah, blah.
It's like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, I mean, do you know somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody who's from Pakistan? I get it, you're out.
Right. But it's become entirely different from 2000, when not only both parties were courting Muslims who were really stepping up their voter registration efforts and becoming much more involved in American politics, but George Bush and the Republican Party, in fact, were extremely active in developing relationships with Muslim organizations and really courting Muslim leaders. That's not something you hear from either party these days, and it's assumed if somebody does really reach out to Muslim supporters that that's something you can use against them. It is assumed to be a weakness or potentially something that would be damaging to their campaign. And that, I think, is a huge problem here because, as you have pointed out, one of the ways to push back against this is to have both kind of a publicly symbolic way to do it, but also to have leaders who are willing to stand up and say, no, this is wrong. And as we saw during the Ground Zero Mosque stuff last year, there were few and far between people who were willing to say, absolutely, this is wrong. They would say, oh, well, maybe they should move it to another location, or, there are lots of sensitivities around this, but very few people who would just say, no, we shouldn't be doing this.
Yes, we have a dearth of leadership. What a surprising state to find ourselves in. Although, I mean, in some ways, you just sort of wonder the sort of the alternative universe where, Mitt Romney sort of grows a personality and then a soul. He seems like the guy who could do that. As a crass political calculation, I just sort of had this sort of probably naive sort of wishful thinking idea that it would work. It would actually work really well. That it allows someone to take this principle stand. If he really wants to give Obama a run for his money, then that's what he does. That's what he separates himself. He can be as conservative as he wants, and he can uphold conservative values, which respect citizenship. I think it would go over well. I think there's obviously a fraction of people out there who would say no way. I think there's a lot of people who are sort of on the fence, but would be shamed into coming along. It's not going to happen, and I think we sort of settled into this sort of real sort of ugly low cycle where this is the catch-all enemy. You know, I mean, I'm reminded of some years ago there was a documentary producer who was out at a big mega church in Colorado Springs, and they'd gathered pastors from all over the country to talk about culture war. They were into fighting it. And so where are the front lines in the culture war? And the debate sort of fell between, is it against the gays or against the Muslims? Mm-hmm. And I think today, at that time, apparently the debate sort of fell on the side of the Muslims. The Muslims are the enemy. Now, you know, we have the gays, the Muslims, the immigrants, and it's sort of this sort of tired cycle that keeps going around. I mean, it's surprising to hear these Republican candidates use these issues because they didn't work last time. They don't get you elected. They get you pretty far. They do a lot of damage. And I'm not saying the Democrats are noble, because what they do is they give the Democrats cover to be cowardly on these issues as well. But they've got to break out of that sort of that hamster wheel of hate that they're on, and take a stand. I mean, let them hate Obamacare. Let them charge socialism. Let them use all these sort of ideological fights. But let's get citizenship off the table. It's just not an interesting issue, is it? I mean, and here we are talking about it.
Well, you brought up the idea of an alternate universe Romney. So maybe for a few minutes, let's talk about the alternate universe Romney, who may be Jon Huntsman, who is kind of the candidate of the week, at least here in D.C., where everybody's talking up his candidacy, which he has announced he will announce. And he's at least put out the first ad. He's got John Weaver running his campaign, who is always a good political mind, and has a lot of money people behind him who want to think he's the guy who could win. At the same time, he's somebody who supports civil unions, who is distancing himself from his Mormon roots and gives kind of the liberal answer of "I'm spiritual but not religious" when he talks about his faith. But I have to say, when I heard him at the Ralph Reed conference, the Faith and Freedom one, a couple of weeks ago, I was really impressed. I had wondered whether there was any possible way that a Mormon candidate could really succeed with social conservatives. And I can't say for sure that he would be able to do it. But I came away really much more convinced that he could. And it was because he just had a way of connecting and a way of talking that I found very familiar. He spent a long time talking about his adopted daughters, and in particular telling the story about his daughter, Gracie May, who was born in China, who was abandoned in this vegetable market. And he told a long story about how his wife had been at a fundraiser and had to kind of name a tree, I think, that she had donated, and said it was Gracie May Huntsman. And at that moment, or at that time, they didn't have an adopted daughter yet. But they got home to a message that, in fact, there was a daughter for them. And she had named that tree at 8:15 in the evening. And when they got home, that message had been left at 8:15 in the evening. And I have to tell you, evangelicals eat that stuff up. Any story that involves a coincidence like that, I can't tell you how many times I heard that growing up in the Baptist church, because it is evidence of God's will, that obviously that was something that God wanted. And he also managed to move that even further by talking about how when people ask Gracie who found her in the vegetable market, she says Jesus. And the crowd was just full of awe in response to that. And it was brilliant because it was the language of evangelicalism and of God's will working in your life. It was a way of getting into his story that his family worshiped Jesus, and that was a big part of who they were, without ever having to talk about his Mormonism or about what his actual faith was. And I don't know how far that could take him. Certainly he would start to get questions, and there would be definitely a lot of rumors being pushed if it looks like he was actually going to be a front runner. But again, it just I came away from that with added respect for his ability to talk the talk in a way that I don't think Mitt Romney could ever get away with, because it's just not the way he talks to people.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's partly, I think, a generational thing, too, and also just, Romney's, I mean, Dana Milbank's got a great column this week on, Romney's kind of a dork. He's just not a very, in person, he's not a smooth character, and Huntsman is, but, you're speaking... You're speaking of alternative universes, and indeed, I think you are speaking of the alternative universe known as Washington, D.C. I kind of took heart from a poll a little while ago here in New Hampshire that I think Huntsman's name recognition was less than 1%.
Yeah.
And I liked that. That made me feel good. Not because I don't want Mormons to run for president. I'm happy with Mormons running for president, but because he had this anointing on him, in evangelical speak, and regular folks don't care. I mean, Huntsman does sound familiar to you and to me, because we're evil media elites, and at the end of the day,
we read Time magazine and the Esquire.
Exactly, and I think. More and more. That's why Michele Bachmann's coming out of nowhere.
Yeah.
And it's why I think Sarah Palin is still to be thought of. People don't. There's that idea of a candidate who looks presidential. The only people who want presidents who look presidential are in Washington, who think throughout the election cycle about presidents. I think there's a lot of folks out there who don't care that, in fact, are reassured. That's why they liked Mike Huckabee. He didn't look presidential. Michele Bachmann, with her crazy talk, certainly doesn't seem presidential. And that is this kind of reassuring notion. And I think that is going to trump all the religious concerns for any of these candidates. For Michele Bachmann, it's why Sarah Palin, doesn't matter how fundamental she is. What matters is her oddity, her weirdness, and I think that's just going to keep playing well. I mean, Ron Paul knows that he's never going to win anything, but he's certainly going to push the debate in different directions. Because that's you talk about those kind of can't be coincidence, and that plays well with say evangelicals and conservative Christians. But oddity does too, and that's another trope within evangelicalism. Someone who doesn't seem like it is in some ways the little boy David story, not King David, but boy David. Who is the guy to beat Goliath? It's not the warrior. God uses someone who does not seem like they're up to this task. So God uses David. Sarah Palin, Michele Bachmann, they don't seem to be the brightest people. But God uses them. God has chosen them, and I think that's.
But Jeff, they're both Queen Esther, so I think you're getting your Bible stories confused there.
Exactly, they do. They're not David.
But at our last, because we're coming up on the end of our time shortly here, in our last stab at alternative universes, I think we have to discuss X-Men.
You're just doing that to be nice to me because I'm a geek. Yeah, this is something I thought we should put out there. I'm geeky enough to have gone to see X-Men with a 6-year-old friend, but not geeky enough to know if this is really sort of part of the discussion that's going on with it.
There are no apologies necessary because I am somebody who is anxiously awaiting the Muppet movie that's coming out soon.
Oh, that's the most exciting news of this whole discussion. I didn't know there was a new Muppet.
Oh, yes.
But we'll have to talk about religion issues in Muppet movie because that's really been, they've gotten a free pass.
Well, I'll tell you sometime about my experience at Jesus Puppet Camp when I was in.
Right.
I was too.
Well, maybe in closing, the oddness of X-Men that I thought we put out there, and maybe commenters on Blogging Heads will come and explain all this to us. Is it seemed to pit Jewish Magneto, he's the arch-villain who has, he's in this movie, he's a good guy, and he's going to become an arch-villain.
Right.
Against the good guy, Charles Xavier, head of the X-Men, who counsels forgiveness. Jewish Magneto, a Holocaust survivor, at one point directing a whole fleet of missiles against the U.S. military, shouts, "Never again!" And he is the one who won't forgive. Forgiving Christian Charles Xavier begs Magneto not to kill the Nazi who killed his own mother, that we must forgive even Nazis. And I said, this is really kind of a stark Jewish-Christian divide. It's worth noting that, Bryan Singer, I believe it was a prominent evangelical in Hollywood, or Christian in Hollywood, has returned to the franchise. And I'm not going to say it's an anti-Semitic movie. I mean, it seems sort of like a very real attempt to fully explore the viewpoint that would say, forgiveness is not legitimate. We should defend ourselves against aggressors. But it was a very stark Jewish-Christian divide in a summer blockbuster. More religion than I've seen, I think since years ago in The Matrix. And, where this leaves us and what this says for the prospect for the Muppet movie. Well, obviously Kermit, do we think? I mean, I'm Jewish, so I'd like to think that
Kermit's Jewish. He does have kind of a, Woody Allen type.
Exactly. He seems more modern than Woody Allen.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe that'll be the great revelation, is that the Miss Piggy is in fact the world's first Jewish pig. And, so this will be a breaking down barriers, and all the rest of the Muppets are Muslim.
Right, and a kosher
we'll all
Jewish
stand
pig
together
at
in
that.
solidarity and sing songs.
Yeah,
Thanks so much.
You have put X-Men on my movie list. Not that I get out to see movies anymore, but everybody's been talking about the Tree of Life and its spiritual content and themes.
Spiritual but not religious, yes, exactly.
I had not heard that about X-Men, so I will have to get out and see it.
Great talking to you, Amy. Take care.
Good. Take care, Jeff. Bye-bye.